Hey everyone, it's time for Russia and the post-Soviet states. So without any further delay, let's get right and started with this. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of territory here to cover. We have Russia, the Russian Federation, more specifically, the largest country in the world in terms of its geographic size, and the ninth most populous country in the world, mainly because much of this land is not really habitable, and we'll look at some pictures and you'll get an idea why you wouldn't probably like to live in some of those places as well. But furthermore, this is an expansive region. There's a lot of different territories to cover, those subregions that we always talk about. So we have the, let's say, the European Russia, from what we would consider Europe, which we just talked about in Chapter 4, to the Ural Mountains. They'll come through and they run from north to south into Kazakhstan. It's a mountain range. If we think of something that we've already covered, think of the Appalachian Mountains in terms of that type of mountain range and what you'd see. Now you have west of that, we have Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova in this section as well. Countries that are a bit of in a tug-of-war position, which we'll talk about, between the EU and the Russians. And so there's that region there. We have the Caucasus region of the Caucasus Mountains, nestled here between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, major bodies of water that are so important. Caspian Sea being the largest lake in the world. And then we have the Central Asian states, the Stan countries, if you will, the land of. And we have those right there. So if you look at the geography here, we'll talk about the climate, of course, like we always do. But we'll talk about this low-lying area here in Russia, and obviously just west of it, the European plain that moves into the Ural Mountains. And then we'll have a lowland area that is the largest plain in the world. That would be east of the Ural Mountains, before you have a plateau, a highland area, and then you have more mountainous areas as you move further eastward, and then you have some steppe areas down here south of those into where are, again, our Central Asian republics that sort of trickle about there into Mongolia, which we'll talk about later on, and of course, and then in our Central Asian republics. So this is 11 independent countries in addition to Russia. These are all the post-Soviet states because they're all at one time this made the USSR or the Soviet Union. At one time, this expansive piece of territory. Now we have Russia and 11 other independent countries. Part 1, always physical geography. I just explained that. One other notable thing that would be worth explaining here, now that I have some better imagery up, as I explained it with a political map instead of a physical geographic map, so a little bit more useful now. You could actually see these things that I've demonstrated. But we have the Volga River, Europe's largest river. That's west of the Ural Mountains. It runs down into the Caspian Sea. Very important there. You see those Caucasus Mountains a little bit more clearly. You see this steppe region here. There's that plain that I talked about, world's largest. Before you get into that highland area again, that plateau. And you can see the lowland area here was at one point a breadbasket for the Russian Federation, or the Soviet Union at the time. In terms of agricultural production, because of that lowland area and that fertile soil, that black fertile soil, the Cherzonim. And then you can see further out into the rest and see how that again turns into some mountains before you go into the Kamchatka Peninsula and out of the Pacific Ocean. This area is bordering obviously the Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and two major seas here to form again the largest country in the world. And there'll be some pictures coming up to demonstrate some of these landforms that you'll see. Seeing here is Siberia, Russia, which is obviously a large geographic area that's in the eastern part of Russia, that less populated area. Most of the population of Russia is situated closer to Europe. We have the coast of Georgia. Again, Georgia nestled between those two seas. Here the Black Sea, and Uzbekistan, one of those Stan countries, the Central Asian republics. And you can see that steppe climate, the steppe geography and the steppe climate that you'll see, and we'll talk about the climate in just a second. But there you can see a fundamental difference between Siberia and Uzbekistan. And these images are to kind of portray the differences in terms of both climate and physical geography. Again, this is a large territory, not a lot of different countries, but in the sense that the geography and the climate vary quite differently because of its proximity to different physical geographic features, whether they're lowlands, or areas that are within that most center point of the Eurasian continent with those large temperature fluctuations. Lowland areas are great for farming in the Ukraine, like I mentioned. Those farm fields. Kyrgyzstan there you can see a little bit different of a climate than what we saw there in Siberia, of course. And Tajikistan here, the Pamir Mountains, mountains that are important for they have some glaciers there that feed some important rivers, which feed some agriculture and nourish some humans with their water. And because of climate change, of course, that's all under some distress right now. And so again, this is an area that's bordering the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan, a little bit close to Afghanistan, and so you can help position this region, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But first, the climate. It's important to know that semi-arid desert steppe area that we were just talking about. Of course, in that Central Asian Republic area, Central Asian states of the former Soviet Republic here. Humid continental, we talked about that humid continental climate when we talked about Central Europe and then into Eastern Europe. It is that same type of climate that you would see as you move into the center of a continent. And then, of course, subarctic and tundra conditions for most of the Russian Federation in terms of its landmass, area that's not quite friendly for human inhabitants, not exactly the place that's very densely populated, of course, very sparse population there. And we know why, because it's harsh living conditions, not too friendly for humans, of course, and so that's why you see much of that population more concentrated west. Interestingly, between the seas in those Caucasus region, the Caucasus Mountains, we see some Mediterranean type climate type, so this area producing some of those same types of agricultural productions that we saw in Europe and in California, where you see some citrus fruits, some olives, nuts, and those types of good things. And so that's important for the region because it offers it sort of differentiates between the type of agricultural production that you'd see with maybe something like cotton here in the Central Asian states, and something different than what you would see in the agricultural production of Russia, of course. You would see that down in the Mediterranean climate type within Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Vegetation, some geographical terms, some vocabulary terms to go backwards and focus on these because it's kind of important to show how this influences the human development of this huge landmass that we call Russia and Eurasia. And the taiga are some subarctic coniferous forests. You can see that range there dominating Russia. If you could see that map there, that large green swatch, if you see over there, over most of the entire country of Russia, obviously sprinkled throughout Canada and Northern Europe as well, of course, but again, very important in terms of the physical geography, the vegetation and climate, that of Russia. Now the tundra north of the taiga, you can see that it follows northward pattern above the taiga, treeless area, and that's important because it's between the tree line and the ice caps. And again, you can deduce the type of human-environment interactions that are occurring in this region, or lack thereof. Permafrost is a permanently frozen soil that lies just beneath the active soil layer, and you can see that demonstrated in a small image right there. And that's going to be important because as we go through and we experience climate change, which we're in the midst of, and we can learn this in our book and obviously through other resources that are actually coming out right now, some journal articles, scientific publications, and we're reading about the permafrost because the world is warming, permafrost is melting, and therefore in a way expediting climate change because of that process. Okay, here's a picture of the taiga. It would be helpful to understand that coniferous forest and that type of imagery that we would see in a large portion of the Russian geography. There, tundra, again, you have some low lying vegetation, no trees there because we're north of the tree line at this point, and there you can see permafrost as illustrated there. We're getting right into the environment now. This chapter is going to move a little bit more quickly for you. I'm highlighting some of the more key terms and going to try to streamline this for you and reduce the amount of content for this slide. 40% of Russia's territory began demonstrating systems of environmental degradation or ecological stress by the 1990s. Stalin, of course, a famous leader of the Soviet Union that we'll talk about a little bit later, but let's move a little bit forward before we move back to talk about Stalin. We'll talk about that he was no friend of the earth, of course. He was no friend of Mother Nature. He was no friend of humans, for that matter, but more on that in a second. But over time, this pursuit of industrialization during the Soviet Union time, a lot of felled trees, a lot of environmental degradation, and so you see these natural forests obviously were passed on for the purpose of industrialization and sparking the Soviet Union's economy through industrialization and manufacturing. So a lot of trees come down during this time. Then we could talk about the nuclear power facility, Chernobyl. I'm sure you've heard of it, or I hope you've heard of it. 1986, major disaster there. It left the city to become a ghost town, illustrated there. There's some movies about it, a lot of pop culture, but obviously hard to put a number on the human health impact here, but thousands of people probably get cancer as a result of this. Birth defects present in the area because of all this radiation poisoning that took place in this nuclear disaster that took place in a facility here in the former Soviet Union, now in present-day Ukraine. Water. Okay, so water it's we talked about this at the beginning in our intro chapter, the commodification of water. This could become important. It could, if one day water becomes as rich of a resource as we imagine it to be, like oil, Russia would be well poised, as well as Canada and other parts of the world, because of that share, and the lion's share in this case, large share of water. So Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake in terms of volume, not geographic size, contains about 20% of the world's fresh water. Seen here, picture of it, of course, to help visualize. And if you remember, about 20% of the world's fresh water was in our Great Lakes, our North American Great Lakes that we sit between the border of the United States and Canada. We thought it was pretty awesome that they had about 20% of the world's water within those 5 lakes. And here, this blows this out of the water, pun intended. I was not planning on that, but there it goes. About 20% of the world's fresh surface water here in one specific lake in eastern Russia. 1/5 of the world's entire freshwater can be found in Russia. Again, very important when it comes to freshwater usage as the world continues for that to be a bit more of a commodity, in the sense that the world's distribution of fresh water is in fact not equitable. And even in Russia, it's certainly not. These are areas that their freshwater supply is not evenly distributed throughout Russia, as we obviously see is not evenly distributed around the world. Further in that water theme is the loss of the Aral Sea, or the Aral Sea, if you're speaking Russian. The Aral Sea, once the 4th largest lake in the world, certainly nowhere near that now, because you can see a picture there, 1989, things look pretty good, and in 2014, hard to imagine that that's even the same geographic location. What happens in the 1960s, some diversion takes place for agricultural purposes of some rivers that would flow down and support the Aral Sea. Because of that diversion, less and less water makes its way to this specific spot, and of course it begins to dry, it begins to salinate, and so we see here is this sea's basically gone. What happens? Well, the fishing industry here collapses, it creates dust storms, human health impact, negative human health impact in the area, and it becomes 3 small separate bodies of water, quite small and quite useless. There are attempts to revitalize this area through dam building and rediversion. We'll have to stay tuned and see how that continues to take place as this area, different needs are taking place. Some people want it for agriculture, some people want to restore the water to what was once its massive form, and we'll have to see sort of what direction takes place there, as this is situated in a border area, but also regarded as one of the largest ecological disasters, human-made ecological disasters in all the world. taking the fourth largest lake in the world, fourth largest lake in the world, and it becomes essentially nothing because of human-environment interactions, and humans doing a bad thing, of course, to the land again. So climate change, expansive forests in Russia play a major role in absorbing global CO2. We know that obviously forests do a good job mitigating, our human impact of carbon emissions in the world, sucking that up. Large expansive forests, you can imagine that taiga dominating a lot of Russia. And Russia ranks fourth in the world for greenhouse gas emissions. Largest in Europe, however, still less than the United States. And again, that could be, you could say that's mitigated by their forests in terms of that, and a little bit kinder now. They're signed on to the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accord, some ones that predate the Paris Climate Accord. And they hit their levels because those were going to 1990 levels. And if you can imagine, the Soviet economy in 1990 was certainly not booming. It was not doing very well. So it wasn't hard to meet those 1990 baseline levels in terms of emissions. So they've hit that. They've been successful, if you will, but certainly not in terms of their willingness, like we saw with the rest of Europe, to combat climate change. We're just not seeing that out of them. And in terms of this specific sub-region in this greater region of Russia, the post-Soviet states, Central Asian states be the most vulnerable sub-region in this section because really their reliance on those rivers that are stemming from some glacial melting, and obviously melting at a different pace will certainly alter their source of fresh water going forward. So that was done in a hurry. I jotted us through that pretty quickly, but that takes care of the physical geography and the environment for Russia and the post-Soviet states. I did that in record time, and let's get started on the human dimensions coming up next.